Hello and welcome to the Dental Innovator podcast. Today we are joined by Ammar, and your company is called Fitrus Training. Is that correct?
Absolutely spot on.
Where did that name come from, out of interest?
That's a great question. Fitrus is actually it's a legendary story actually. So some people think that this story actually comes from Greek mythology. So I don't know if you've heard about the story of the two people who are flying too close to the sun, Icarus, right? That famous story. So apparently this story sort of derives from there. But there was a name of an angel by the name of Fitrus who had his wings clipped, right? And he was sort of down on earth. And, he saw these angels sort of flying overhead. He sort of called out and asked, "Where are you lot going?" We're saying, "Look, we're going to go and meet this holy personality, that's where we're going." And he says, would you be able to sort of pick me up and take me with you? I'd love to come and sort of hitch a ride. And, they said, "Fine, okay, great." So they sort of carried him along. And what happened was that he sought intercession through this holy personality to say, could you ask God to give me my wings back? And that's exactly what happened. So whilst it's sort of seen as sort of mythical legend or maybe even religious legend, I find the story really interesting because I find that it's a story about hope. So the fact that the person, or Fitrus, the angel in this case, was hopeful that this could happen, and the fact that he actually went and sought out help. Which is sort of the reason why I coined my company Fitrus Training, because for me it's about putting in hope, number one, but secondly it's always about asking, right? You've got to be able to ask the question and always ask for support and ask for guidance, which I think is so critical. So that's kind of where I came from, if that makes sense.
Interesting. So I wanted to talk a little bit about you, your background, and how you're getting involved in the dental industry. If you could elaborate for me, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, fantastic. So essentially, I work with dental practice owners and their teams. And these dental practice owners, having spoken to so many now, are really frustrated. And they're frustrated for a variety of reasons. But I think one thing in particular, which I think can be a real challenge, is the fact that their teams are just not working in sync. Right, their communication is a bit of a struggle between the team. Personality clashes. You've got some real heavy personalities in the dental world, and it's a high pressure environment, right? As I'm sure you know and your listeners know. And as a consequence of that, what's happening is that at these practices, team members, and especially, as a matter of fact, dental nurses especially, are leaving in their droves. And it's really tough, right, to find these great talent, to find good dental nurses, to find great team members, and more importantly, for them to stick around, right? And so what I do is that I come in and I provide what's known as emotional intelligence training. So I get them to try and understand how you can actually be able to relate to each other better through empathy skills, how to be able to communicate better, how to understand what your own personality is and the personality of your team so that you can speak their language, right? And as a consequence of that, what I've realized is the team feel more valued, they feel more cherished, and as a consequence, they stick around. They're a lot more loyal, and so practice owners don't have to worry about, focusing on having to train up new members of staff every single time, only for those staff members to leave 3 to 4 months later. They can just focus on growing the business because those team members are sticking around. So that's essentially what I do in a nutshell.
Yeah, I mean, acquiring staff is hard enough. So retention is incredibly important, and a big part of retention is to make sure that your staff are pretty happy, right? And I can definitely say with absolute certainty, it doesn't matter what business you're running, that managing staff is probably the hardest part of running a business, and across many industries. So how do you feel like, so you've interacted with dental practice owners, where do you feel they're most deficient in terms of emotional intelligence, and where do you think, what are the most common mistakes that dental practice owners are making?
Okay. So I'm just concerned at this stage. The last thing I want is for your listeners to be switching things off and moving along. So yeah, I want people to stick around. But no, for sure. Look, I'll be honest here. I think where the biggest struggle lies when it comes to EQ is I think it's twofold. First of all, and I'll be frank with you, I think this is more of a male issue than a female issue, right? I think it's a male-dominated problem. And that's a general trend, by the way. There are always exceptions to the trend. I think that, first of all, there is a lack of an understanding of what it is that men are experiencing, right? So the vast majority, right, of dentists, right, are men, right? And what you'll find is, especially when it comes to men's emotional vocabulary, it can be quite narrow, right? So the very first part of emotional intelligence is this ability to actually label one's own emotions accurately. And if you're not actually able to do that, if you don't understand how you're feeling, you will not be able to understand how your nurse is feeling, how maybe a different associate might be feeling, how your TCO is feeling, how your receptionist is feeling. If you're struggling yourself, how are you going to be able to identify with other people, right? So that's the first sort of big issue that I find. And I suppose I've kind of touched on this in a bit, but in terms of the second part of it, it's this idea of being empathetic, right? So that ability to be able to connect with their team members in a better way. It was really interesting because I went to the North of England dentistry show just a weekend gone, and I was speaking to someone there, and they mentioned how, it's really fascinating how with dentists, whether they're practice owners or associates or whoever else, they're really good at being able to empathize with their patients. They've got a fabulous ability to be able to do that, to connect on their level. But when it comes to their team members, it's completely different, and there's a bit of a cognitive dissonance there, right? Where they have got that ability with patients, but then they struggle with team members, right? So that's where I find sort of the biggest sort of disconnect there. And it's trying to sort of address that disconnect in a better way that gets them to realize that, actually, I could use those transferable skill sets with my team members, and they're going to be sticking around and they'll like me a lot more.
So, yeah, I mean, just on one part, I actually think there might be more women than men in dentistry, but I think practice ownership, there may be more men in those positions. I'm not 100% sure on the statistics, but there might well be more male practice owners. That's something that will hopefully change as time passes.
Agreed.
Yeah, because women are definitely fantastically skilled dentists and some of the best people in the industry. So more and more, I'd be happy to see more and more get there and really push it. And there's a lot of them I'm aware of that already are. So that's cool. I think as well, one thing that I find tricky is it doesn't matter whether you're male or female. The problem is when you're a practice owner, it's very rare that you're not practicing as a dentist within your own practice at the same time. And I think one thing that's very tricky is managing. You feel like you're spread very thin. So you're trying to manage patients. You're probably the biggest generator of revenue, and you're trying to manage staff. And I think that in of itself, obviously males may struggle more with it, but I feel like women and men combined, everyone in the industry who's a practice owner will probably at times struggle with finding that balance and making sure that they can focus on tasks and their patients and deliver the best possible care without constantly being distracted by things that are going on in and around them. So that's something that, I wonder what your take on that is.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think balance is such a tricky thing, right? It seems like that is almost like it's the nirvana that everyone really just wants to try and attain, right? But it feels almost impossible at times because there's just so many hats that dental practice owners are wearing. As you quite rightly stated, you've got your patients to think about, you've got your team to think about, you've got the business as well that's growing as well, and you want to think about the financial aspect as well. So as a consequence of that, I think a lot of them can at times deprioritize, right, the team, because it's almost a given to say, you know what, the team will always be there, that they'll look after things, they could take on the workload. If there's anything, just constantly delegate. And at times, team members can feel sort of underappreciated and undervalued. And I think that's where good EQ comes into place. A lot of the times I find that the first thing that practice owners will tell me is, well, is this going to cost the earth? Is this something that, we're going to have, huge pay rises and that sort of thing? And look, that's not what I'm preaching here, right? I think what we're sort of focused on is just talking about the little things, right? A very simple appreciation in the most basic of ways can actually go a long way, because, pleasing team members is really not that difficult. It doesn't just have to be through people's pocket, right? There are a variety of different ways to do so. And so I find that the moment practice owners recognize that and turn that into a habit, because it is a habit in and of itself, the moment they make it habit, it can go so far to making sure that team stays loyal, stays with you, and will be with you through thick and thin, regardless of what the situation is, right? Because as we well sort of recognized a few years back with the pandemic, things can change, rapidly. And if your team members aren't around for that, then when are they going to be around, right?
Yeah. What kind of quick tips and strategies would you give a practice owner listening to the podcast that they can implement that may well improve that relationship and that feeling of the team within their practice?
Great question. So I'll tell you what, this is going to sound rather bizarre, but I'm going to take a leaf from a really famous book, which is actually about relationships, right? So I don't know if you've heard of a book called The 5 Love Languages by any chance, have you?
Yeah, I've heard of it, yeah.
You have? Okay, fine. So that book was written by a pastor by the name of Dr. Gary Chapman, all right? Now, just for those listeners who may not have read the book, this actually is contextualized towards relationships, right? Traditional personal relationships. And I find that book can actually be very relevant to any other relationship, right? It can be between a parent, right? Father and child, mother and child, personal relationships, siblings, and also, of course, in the team as well when it comes to business relationships. And so when it comes to these love languages, look, love is the fundamental essence in all of these relationships, right? And that may sound fluffy, but that is the reality of it, right? That's what makes the world go round. And so what I find is that, this book talks about how there are what's known as 5 love languages, okay? Everyone has a different way in which they like to have love received, right? They like to feel appreciated for what they do. And it is a language. It's something that is inherent to them, right? Some may be bilingual, some may be trilingual, but ultimately you'll have one which you are most comfortable with. And so I find that what the most important thing is first of all to identify the love language of your team member, right? So there are 5 different ones. The first one is what's known as physical touch, right? So that could be, a high five, it could be a spud, it could be, a hug, whatever is appropriate, right? And just bearing that in mind, all right? So that is one thing, right? The physical touch. The second thing is gifts. Now, gifts is an interesting one, and I find that gifts which are done on a regular basis then lose their touch, right? So a really simple example. So for instance, you may want to do a one-off where, let's say, the last Friday of the month, you're buying breakfast for the team, right? You're bringing in some breakfast. They have an early morning, before the morning stand-up or whatever, you have something there to eat, and everyone enjoys themselves a little bit, right? Or for example, at lunchtime, you're buying them lunch, right? For instance, just as a one-off. So these, those little things I think can go, the full way. So that's one thing, physical touch, gift giving. The third thing is around acts of service, right? So act of service is going out of your way to try and make things better. So let me give you a really good example of this. So I observed this at a dental practice where I was doing a course at, and I was so we were actually in the surgery room when I was doing my training, and we had a little bit of a break. So they went out, had a coffee or a tea or whatever. And I was still there, and I was just having a nose around just to see what's around. And I noticed that there were these sort of stacks of cups, sort of plastic cups, by the sink. And I had a look inside, and I just sort of pulled out one cup after the other. And inside each of these was a mouthwash tablet, right, that you obviously use. You dissolve and create a mouthwash. And what was really interesting was the fact that this, I spoke to the nurse, right, afterwards, just to say, is this something that you do as normal? And she mentioned that, look, this is not usually, normal procedure from where I've seen it anyway, right? Usually it's sort of done as and when it's required. But I generally do this in advance for the dentist who's going to be with me on the other side of that chair, so that it's a nice, rapid, quick way of doing things, right? And it's an act of service in and of itself, and makes things so much easier and smoother for the dentist as well as for the patient, right? And I thought that little touch there, I thought was absolutely brilliant, right? So that's a really good example of an act of service. The fourth one is what's known as quality time, right? So quality time in a high stress pressurized environment is a difficult thing to do, right? And I do appreciate that at the best of times. I think quality time must not be construed with quantity of time, all right? So it's not just a case that I am, for example, spending 10 minutes with a particular team member to talk about a particular issue, right? That's not what it's about. What it is that if a team member was to flag something up, that there's something wrong that's happening, right? Whether that is a specific procedure, or whether that is a certain policy's been broken, or whatever the case might be, that person is given the time of day to actually, get their feedback heard, right? And it's not just a case that you're just simply shutting that down, right? So that is a really good example of quality time there. So I think these are four of them. I'm just trying to remember what the fifth one actually is. So you had physical touch, you had gifts, you had acts of service, quality time, and there's also words of appreciation, right? That was the last one as well. So actually, thanking them for their efforts, right? And not only just thanking them, but it's actually being specific about it at the same time, right? So you're thanking them for a very specific thing that they did, right? So the fact that, if, for instance, as a practice owner, you notice that one of your associates has, gone through lunch and worked a little bit longer on a particular case because they knew that particular patient, for example, may not be able to come back another day, or they've worked a little bit harder on that particular case just to make sure that patient is treated as a 5-star patient. Just going out of the way to say, you know what, I noticed that you did that, actually. Thank you so much. That meant the world to me, right? And just little things, picking that up and being specific can be really, really helpful. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, that made sense. Yeah, so there's some good little tips there, and like I said, I'm always going to come back to this, is that it's a tough one. It's a tough one as a practice owner to do, because it's just extra things for you to possibly think about, that your bandwidth may be mostly filled by the treatments and the work that you're trying to do in the surgery. So as you've been talking, I've been thinking your training would be fantastic for practice owners, obviously, but it'd be even better for practice managers, because they've actually got a little bit more time, a little bit more space to have these little interactions. And a lot of the things that you're talking about are, I heard an interview by Elon Musk, and he was saying that these big practice meetings, or he wasn't saying practice, big team meetings are a waste of time. You want to be doing little touching points, little quick touching points with everyone, so that retention of their attention is maximized, and also the message that you're delivering is very specific. So these little touching points, obviously practice owners can do and implement, and I have been trying to do that. But I feel like a practice manager could be in a situation where they could do that a little bit more frequently and have their eye on quite a lot of different things that maybe we're distracted in surgery, and just focus on our own little world and our own little zone. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I see what you mean by that. And I suppose, as PMs, they're boots on the ground a lot more often, aren't they? Yeah, absolutely. I think it could certainly be of more value to them. And I think, what the interesting thing is in all of this is, I think what's absolutely critical is just to have that power of observation, right? Because whilst you may be thinking about a million different things, or thinking about, whatever it is that you're thinking about, as a consequence of that, you might be missing out on some of these little things. So it's not just, important to be able to observe the little things and be conscious of them and acknowledge them, right? Point them out. But that at the same time is actually to have the presence of mind, to be present in that particular moment, rather than as you're sort of going up and down the stairs, if the surgery is on 2 floors, for instance, right? You're sort of doing one task and thinking about 5 others. You're being present in the moment, and you're being watchful as you're going around. So yeah, absolutely. Practice managers, I think, could certainly find that to be tremendously valuable when it comes to this sort of thing. That's for sure.
Yeah, and then emotional intelligence, I think, works two ways. So, one, it's from the practice owners to the team, but there's also a team to the practice owner as well, to understand that there's a hell of a lot of pressure that comes with being a practice owner. Do you address that in any of your training as well?
Yeah, so just to make sure I've understood you correctly, it's just understanding that EQ is a dual dynamic, correct? Yeah, absolutely. It really is. And there's this beautiful concept which is known as mirroring, right? And human beings, we naturally mirror each other, both on a physical level, but as well as on an emotional level as well. So, just as a really good example, I'll tell you a personal story, right? So when I was first getting to know my wife, from my sort of cultural background, as I'm sure you're aware, with sort of an Asian background, there are times when there will be what's known as an arranged marriage, right? And that's the route that I went down. Now, just to clarify for listeners, an arranged marriage is essentially where someone is pointed out as a potential suitor, and then I have the choice, or the person, obviously the other person as well has the choice, whether to say yes or no. You get to know them a little bit, and then you make a decision. So I was taking my wife out on a date, and we're getting to know each other. And I said, let me test out this physical mirroring stuff in reality, right? Let's see what happens. So as I'm sort of talking to her and telling her a little bit about my life, what I sort of do is I take my hand and just take my right palm and rest it on my right cheek like that, right? And I'm just sort of talking to her as I go along. And lo and behold, 2 minutes later, she does exactly the same thing. She goes and does exactly that. And I thought, bloody hell, this thing works. I thought, all right, fine, let me try something else. So, we've got a clear table, and sort of it's a see-through transparent table sort of between us. And what I did was I sort of crossed one leg over the other, just to see how, what she would do. And lo and behold, exactly the same thing. 2 or 3 minutes later, she does exactly the same thing. I thought, wow, goodness me, she's actually listening, and this thing actually works. So this is the thing, right? As human beings, we physically mirror one each other when we are in sync, and we also emotionally wired as well at the same time. So when it comes to emotional intelligence, the moment that you see PMs or practice owners are giving that feedback and showing that consideration, right, and being emotionally connected and being empathetic with their team members, you'll see exactly the same thing happening the other way, right? Because their team members were saying, hey, I'm being recognized here, right? I really appreciate that. Thank you. What's going on with the practice owner? What's happening with the PM? Let's also try and ensure that we're being empathetic. And that's not something that's happening on a conscious level, by the way. That's happening on a subconscious level, because they recognize that they're now feeling grateful for what it is that they're experiencing. Is happening the other way around as well. And that happens naturally. And that's something we've got to be mindful of. 100%. It has to work both ways. It's really, really important. That's for sure.
What's your take on backbiting and things that people have an experience in workplaces, specifically, obviously, dental workplaces, and how to navigate that?
That's a very interesting question. That is a very interesting question around backbiting and gossiping and all that sort of thing. Look, I think what that ultimately boils down to is company values, right? And practice values. What are the values of our practice? I think a lot of the times, and I don't just see this, by the way, in dental practices, by the way, I think this is companies in general. I think a lot of them don't recognize what their mission is, what their vision is, what their values are. And even if they do have them maybe written out somewhere shiny on the wall, they're not necessarily put into practice, right? There may be a lot of talk, but is there a lot of walk when it comes to these values? And I think this is where it's so important that we have company values, not only that are written on the wall, but that are being practiced from the top downwards, right? So PMs, practice owners, other associates, for instance, people who are seen as in quote unquote positions of power within the practice, within, that clinic, are actually practicing this as they go along. So I think that's what it boils down to on one level. I think the other thing is also understanding that, there's a difference between treating a person like a person and then treating them like an object, right? And it's, it's so critical, not only within team theory dynamic, but also within sort of team-patient relationships as well. At the end of the day, as I'm sure you know, it's not a tooth that walks through the door, right? It's a person that walks through the door, right, with that pain. So you've got to treat that person as a person. The same works for the team as well, right? That person on the other side of that chair, that nurse who's helping you on the other side of that chair, right, is not just an object for you to say, you know, to mention what it is that's going on and getting them to give you your equipment and making sure everything is all clean and snazzy and ready to go. It's not just that. She or he is a person as well, right? And just to be able to recognize that. And so the moment that starts to happen and you start treating them as a person as opposed to an object, hopefully, at least, that is the theory anyway, that the amount of backbiting reduces, right, as a consequence. So it's just being really mindful of that, I think. That's very important. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. And how do you feel like the training that you offer? So first off, is it like where you come and visit a practice, or is that usually the format? And then the second part of the question would be, what kind of return will a practice owner get from that training? Now, the reason I always do that is because I'm always thinking about ROI, and most of the practice owners who are listening to this will also be doing the same thing. So that part one and part two of that question, if you can answer that, would be awesome.
Yeah, amazing. Let me, if you don't mind me asking, Harry, before I answer that question, let me ask you a question as well in return, right? So when it comes to training, right? So when it comes to training a new team member, so you've got someone who's newly onboarded, how much do you reckon that costs in terms of time and money to be able to train that team member up to a level where you think, right, they're at where they're at?
There's a lot of variables there. It's hard to give you an exact figure on that, but it's going to take quite a bit of time. So that means it's going to obviously take quite a bit of an expense, a fairly significant expense, especially if it's someone like my time, who's a little bit more valuable. Not to blow my own trumpet, but
sure.
Yeah,
absolutely. And this is the thing, right? So for me, the way that I like to do it, and the way that I like to see this, and this is a really good example, actually, which I think is quite valuable. So when you walk into a John Lewis or a Charles Towett or wherever it is that you get your shirts from, right? You take a shirt off the shelf, right? And whatever size you are, let's say a 32 regular or whatever it is that you wear, right? That size is yours. But ultimately, there are other people who share that same size with you, right? Anyone else who is a similar sort of frame or built as you could also pick up a 32 regular. But the difference between that size and yours is getting it tailor-made, right? The moment that there is precision to it, that shirt is now yours, right? And that's the way that I like to see my training as well. I do it tailor-made. So if there is a particular problem, a particular issue that the practice owner or the PM or whoever it is speaking to me has a concern with, then I will address that specifically. And that could be done either in person or it could be done online. And the way that I like to see this is I try and do things in the most efficient way possible. So just to make sure that, and ultimately in this business, everyone knows here, right, that time is money ultimately. If you're setting aside half a day or a full day of training for you and your whole team, that means that's patients that are not on chairs, and that's money that is being lost out. So ultimately, I try to ensure that any training that's done, whether that's online or in person, is done in the most efficient way. But to answer your second question as well, in terms of the cost element to this and how much it can benefit, the way that I like to see this is that the moment a practice owner invests in this type of training, emotional intelligence training, what begins to happen is team members communicate better, they understand their own personality, they understand other people's personality, they learn to empathize and can actually communicate better. As a consequence of that, they feel appreciated, they feel valued, they feel cherished, they're going to stick around longer. And what's happening is that you're not wasting your time, your money, your resources, and obviously, as you mentioned in your case, specifically heavy time, money, and resources as well, right? Because ultimately, those staff are staying loyal. They're going to stick around with you. You're not wasting money on that. You're not wasting your mental resources on that either, because you're going to say, I can now focus on growing the business instead. I can focus on other areas of the work because I know that my team are going to be sticking around. And you know what the great thing about this is, Harry, on top of that? This type of training is actually leaks out into their personal lives as well, right? Which I find is so important. As I mentioned earlier, right? Team members are not just people who are objects. They're there from 9 to 6 and that's it. They go home, right? They have lives outside of that clinic, right? And so if you, in a way are also adding value into their personal lives, that is going to tremendously impact, right, the way that they're going to be feeling at work, right? Because if that starts to leak out into their personal lives as parents or as partners or as siblings or whatever the case may be, ultimately that's going to provide them more happiness in the workplace, right? Because if they're happy there, they're going to be happy at the clinic as well, right? So there is so much benefit as far as this is concerned.
And in terms of EQ, etc., one thing is, having dealt with quite a lot of issues, obviously running a practice and managing staff, is determining where it's an EQ issue and determining where it's a fit issue, to jump on the back of your little metaphor there. Yeah. Whether it's a fit issue, what kind of metrics would you advise practice owners to adopt when trying to figure out whether it is a EQ deficiency on either or both sides, or whether it's becoming a fit problem where there may need to be an actual substantive change?
Yeah, great question. So a lot of practice owners, they focus on the what question, right? What is it that this particular team member is good at? What output is it that they're giving to my practice, right? However, the question of how is often missed out. So the question that I'm dealing with when it comes to emotional intelligence is the how. So let's say, for instance, right, the dentist or the associate who's there by the chair has got an idea in their mind, has got something in their mind, right? They want to communicate that over to the nurse, right? They've got something in their head. They're formulating that. That then comes out through their speech. That's then heard by the nurse, and then she then or he then has to interpret that, right? So there is 4 ways, right, where that's going from one person's mind to the next, right? And so much can be missed out along the way. So what I am actually addressing here as far as this training is concerned is the how and not necessarily the what. So to answer your question, when it comes to this idea of fit versus EQ, the first question to ask yourself is this person giving me the output, or have they ever given me the output that I've wanted from them? Are they generally good at what they do? Right? Are they talented at what they do, or have they been talented at what they do? If the answer is yes, then the argument might lie that it could be an EQ problem. It might be a communication issue. It might be the fact that they're unable to empathize with other team members. It might be the fact that they just don't understand difficult personalities, or quote unquote difficult personalities, right? That might be the issue there. If it's a case that this person is not someone who is working up to the standard that the owner or the PM expects it to be, and that has been the case for a long time now, that may then require more of a sort of a best fit approach or an HR approach, if you see what I mean. So understanding things from that perspective as opposed to the communication perspective. I also think that we need to understand this concept, and there's a really nice phrase in the HR world, because my background is in L&D, right, which is sort of HR's younger, trendier sister, you could say. But there's a nice snazzy phrase which is, hire slow and fire fast, right? So if you're having issues and you recognize that this person maybe hasn't been around for a long time, doesn't understand the values of the practice, isn't quite getting on with team members, right, then there's problems there, right? And you're going to have to deal with that and deal with that quickly. But when it comes to the hiring process, that's when actually I think, and this is also where this training can also be valuable from a different perspective, is actually having an understanding of not just trying to measure the person's IQ, but also trying to get an understanding of what their EQ levels are as well, right? And just to try and see whether they would actually be a best fit in your clinic.
Thank you for that. That was a good answer. So in terms of practice owners or clinicians, one thing you mentioned earlier on is that they usually are quite good at empathizing with patients, but not necessarily as good at empathizing and hearing their team members. Why do you think that disconnect exists? So
I think there is a couple of reasons. first of all, I think it also depends on what sort of stuff the practice is doing, whether they're NHS or whether they're private, right? I think that can have a major impact, right? As I'm sure you're well aware, and I'm sure your listeners are also well aware, with the NHS and with targets, it is a lot higher pressure. There is a huge demand, to be able to get patients out of that chair, in and out, nice and quick. And as a consequence of that, you've got complaints which are also going out as well. The potential for complaints to increase is substantially higher in that environment. When we think about sort of the disconnect between the two, right? Why is it that it's there with patients and why is it there with team members? I find that when it comes to patients, there's this sort of old notion and this old phrase where customer is king, right? And this idea that, whatever the patient says, whatever it is that patient wants, we will go out of our way to do it, right? And by any means necessary. And I think that is where sometimes things can get lost, because when we say any means necessary, that doesn't necessarily mean that our team members should be thrown under the bus whilst we're also doing so, right? Or whilst we're treating that patient. So it's just being mindful that there are also boundaries as well to be had when it comes to treating our patients, because at the end of the day, we want to ensure that whilst we are giving our patients the highest possible quality standard of care, at the same time, we want to ensure that, our team members are coming along with us for the ride, right? So I think that's one of the reasons why potentially there is a bit of a disconnect in terms of this idea that, patients are seen as king and there's no sort of boundaries as a consequence. I also just think, there is, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier as well, but I'll just come back to it again. And I think there's this idea which is known as sort of cognitive dissonance, right? Where one set of thinking might be appropriate or seem to be appropriate in one set of environment, but in a different environment, it's seen as being inappropriate completely, even though logically speaking, it's completely fine. And so I think as a consequence of that, there are times when, particularly those who might be practicing, whether that is sort of associates or anyone else for that matter, whilst they're doing their work, there actually is that sort of that cognitive dissonance between the two, where they don't quite recognize that what it is that they're doing in terms of the way that they're actually speaking to their nurses or speaking to their team. And I think as a result of that, you see this sort of difference. It's really interesting because I find that with especially bigger teams as well, what you'll find, and I remember hearing this story from a practice owner who mentioned that he had an issue with an associate who just wasn't able to provide feedback in a constructive manner, right? Or even if that feedback was sort of constructive, it was done without the other person's permission, or was done in front of the patient, right? Leaving the other team member or the colleague embarrassed as a consequence. So I think, it's a challenge in and of itself, but I feel that it's a challenge that is one that can be overcome quite easily. And I don't see it as a weakness. I see it as a challenge, and there's a distinction between the two.
Okay. And I'll just maybe correct one thing, is that NHS dentistry is more time pressure, yes, I would say. Yes. But I say private dentistry is probably more pressure in some ways, especially when you're doing high-end work, because there's more at stake. So, if one of my patients is paying over 10 grand for a treatment, that puts quite a bit of pressure on the clinician and the team. Actually, that's something we have to recognize, that the team also knows how much that patient's paid. So there must be a bit of an increase in pressure for the team as well. It's really funny. It's a really weird one sometimes, because when you're the leader of a business, and most practice owners that are listening to this, and most practice owners that exist in the UK, will be the highest generating clinician in their own practice. And what that does is it puts quite a lot of professional pressure on you as a business owner and as a clinician. It's almost like, you're the front man or woman, you're the person who's our leader, and you're the one who's got to pull these treatments off. So there's actually an expectation sometimes from the team. And as you deliver and as you pass these tests, the team builds this kind of almost an aura around the owner as like, yep, they're the person, they can do this, they're awesome, right? And I think that's a weird one from an EQ perspective to analyze, but I guess it is quite an interesting position to be in as an owner, because you're not just the leader of the business and dictating where the business is going, but you're also the leader from a clinical perspective as well, and dictating how associates work and how you want them to function with patients. So like I said before, it's a really big balancing act, I think, for a lot of dentists. And I think a lot of associate dentists, I think there's a disconnect between associate dentists and practice owners sometimes, because they don't quite understand how much is on the shoulders of a practice owner quite. And I think that's a dynamic as well that could be improved on. Just going back into your background a little bit, Ammar, because we're nearing the end there, and I think it's been a very interesting chat, a very different one. What is your background, and how did you get to this point where you feel like you can step in and help us emotionally inadequate male dentists?
Well, I'll tell you one thing. Can I just say, before I answer that question, I just wanted to actually point out a really interesting observation that I think you just demonstrated there really nicely, actually. So in my last answer, I alluded to the fact that, NHS dentistry is more pressure than private dentistry. And what I loved about the way that you corrected me there was in a very empathetic way. So it was not in a way that was putting me down as a guest and make me feel like I'm inconsiderate. It was put in a way where you mentioned that it was more of a clarification to say that whilst there may be time pressure, there is different, for instance, financial pressure or different types of pressure when it comes to private dentistry. And that right there is a demonstration of high EQ, right? And I'm not massaging your ego. That is precisely just to give you a tangible live example of how that works, right? Because that is exactly what EQ is all about, right? It's just recognize that, okay, something goes wrong, fine, no problem. Let's seek some clarity here. Let's try and get some clarification and understand what's happening, as opposed to going onto the front foot and criticizing, right? So I just wanted to point it out for listeners, because I thought that was demoed really nicely. In terms of sort of my background and why I work with practice owners specifically. So, funnily enough, my story in this world of sort of emotional intelligence and facilitating workshops and that sort of thing, my story, I would say, starts in, well, how far back do we go? Let's put this at 2010, right? So 2010. I was slumped on the dining room table back in North London, where I was living at the time, and I had just failed my second year of a pharmacology degree at the University of Bath, and having failed that, my dad sort of came over to me, and I was all sort of disconsolate, and he mentioned that I should seek the help of a careers counselor. And I thought, fine, that would be a sort of a great idea. Let's go ahead and sort of speak to someone on that front. And so I went up and went ahead and sort of, walked into this guy's office. His name was Asghar. And as he was sort of asking me this whole variety of different questions, he sort of looked over his glasses and sort of analyzed my body language as he went along. And at the end, he let out this tremendous sigh, and he goes and says, "Ammar, pharmacology was never for you. You're the type of guy who is not bound by 9 to 5, who loves working with people, loves new challenges every day. Have you ever tried your hand at business?" I went, "Yeah, fine, why not? Let's give it a go." Because for me, it was just a massive relief that, thank God, this is not entirely all my fault. It just wasn't quite fit for me. So my dad and I, we brainstormed ideas, for days on end, and we came up with the idea of opening up an international ice cream franchise by the name of Baskin-Robbins. I don't know whether any of your listeners have heard of Baskin-Robbins. But yeah, we opened up a Baskin-Robbins ice cream franchise. Still runs to this day, doing really, really well. And it was there that I actually learned about the art of body language, right? And picking up body language from different customers and understanding which people are in a hurry, which people are not in a hurry, who knows what they want, who wants my input, who doesn't want my input. And picking that up was really interesting. But where this actually links into emotional intelligence was, later on, I actually had an opportunity to volunteer at a charity which used to do these leadership development programs for people of ethnic minority backgrounds. And they would basically, I attended one of these courses in 2015 as a participant, and it fundamentally changed the way that I saw things. And the way that I saw this LDP, this leadership development program, was almost like a Swiss Army knife of personal development. So you can use it in any way, shape, or form you wish. And the way that I utilized it was in my marriage, right? So I learned the art of active listening. I learned that conflict was inevitable. It's not something to avoid. And I learned how to fight right. And, you know, ultimately that really transformed my marriage. And I went ahead and became a facilitator on these courses. So it was all to do with personal development, learning leadership capacity, political intelligence, emotional intelligence, all this sort of thing. And it gave me a buzz like nothing else, Harry. And I thought, you know what, this is exactly what I want to do. I want to be facilitating workshops, loads of people, transforming lives. And it's, you know, for me, what I find is at the moment the penny drops, it's just, it's a feeling like nothing else, right? So that from that point onwards was when I sort of decided to do workshop training. I did a lot more work for them, refined my skill sets. And just to cut a long story short, the reason why I sort of decided to go for dentists in particular is that I find, and this is just a generic trend, by the way, there are exceptions to the rule, but I find that those with an exceptionally high IQ can struggle a little bit in the EQ department, right? And in terms of the dental world, you have people who are phenomenally talented, right? I mean, these are people who are incredibly gifted. They are very smart people. And they know that they're smart on top of that, right? And they love to demonstrate it, right? They love them. They're really passionate about their work. But at times that can come across the wrong way, right? And so as a consequence of that, I find, you know what? If I can add value in this world, if I can add value to people who are within the dental industry who are doing this, I think that this could potentially transform not just their practices, it can transform patient care and it can transform their teams. So that's fundamentally why I do what I do.
Awesome. That sounds cool. So, coming to the end, really, Ammar, I think we've covered a lot there in that podcast, and there's a lot of gems of little wisdom from you with actionable things that people can take with them. Is there anything else that you would say as a summation for someone to take away? If let's say there's a practice owner listening to this, something that you think could instantly make some sort of change to the way that they're approaching their team? I know that's a tricky question to answer, but I'll put it to you anyway.
No worries, no, that's fine. That's a fabulous question. So look, I'll summarize this with one really simple tip, right? So EQ can be divided into 5 different areas, right? And I don't want to sort of go into all 5 areas, but I want to talk about one in particular, which is this element of being able to control one's emotions. Right. And so I find that a really good system to actually put into place when it comes to this idea of being able to control one's emotions is this idea of the traffic light system. All right. So imagine a traffic light in your mind. You have red, amber, and green. So the moment that someone says something to you that has an emotional impact, because everything does have an emotional impact to begin with, right? Before we then sort of control that, it's about, first of all, saying, right, in your mind is to say, right, stop. Let me digest what it is that they're saying. Let me, first of all, before reacting, I want to respond to this. Now, how am I going to respond? That's where the amber then comes into play. So you're then formulating open-ended questions where you want to try and seek clarity as to why they said what they said, or to try and elaborate more on what it is that they said so that you can get a better understanding as to whether that person is trying to actually help you for the sake of helping you, or are they actually being nasty and out to get you, right? So that's red, amber, you're formulating that, and green is go, where you give your response as opposed to a reaction saying, go, 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 let's hit back. So that is, I think, a really good way of trying to understand how to control our emotions a little bit better. So it's just having that traffic light system in your head, red, amber, green.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I've found useful for things like that in particular is practicing mindfulness. Whilst in a situation, so that allows you to have a little separation between your internal response and actually reacting, and sometimes actually having rules for yourself where you're going to say, no, before I react to this situation, I'm going to sleep on it and really really choose a response that's appropriate as opposed to being reactive, you know? Yeah. Where can people find you, Ammar, and get in touch with you for more information?
Yep, absolutely. So I'm sure you put this in the show notes anyway, but I think the best way is if you're on social media, I'm very active on Instagram. So at Fitrus Training. So that's FITRUS, Fitrus Training. I'm there on all socials, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, or you can even contact me via email. So that's ammar@fitrustraining.com. Got a website by the same name as well, fitrustraining.com. So yeah, those are all the various ways that people can contact me.
Wicked. And I hope you all enjoyed the podcast. I certainly did. I think I've learned a few things as well. So thank you very much for your time, Ammar. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for listening. Please leave a positive review and share the podcast to your circle. If you'd like to touch base with Dr. Harry Gill or inquire about mentoring, email the Dental Innovator Podcast at gmail.com.